If you really want to improve your chess, grab your board, set up the pieces, and take a moment. What would you play here as black? Pause the video, think it through, and write down your move before we continue. We are looking for weaknesses in the position, either our own to fix or our opponent's to exploit. At the moment, white enjoys a small space advantage in the center, their pawn on e4 against our pawn on d6. We do have a similar edge on the queen side, but central space is what matters more. So the next question is, how do we eliminate white's small strategic edge? Trading central pawns with d5 at some point might do exactly that. But why would white agree to this trade when they can play e5, grab even more space, and do it with tempo? Then we come to a slightly more advanced version of the same plan. We push our pawn to e5 first, and only after that look for the right moment to play d5. But here's the thing, whenever we push a pawn like that, we are not just gaining space, we are also creating weaknesses. In this case, the d5 square becomes an outpost for white, and the pawn on d6 turns into a backward pawn, a potential long-term target. Everything becomes a lot clearer if we ignore the pieces for a moment and just focus on the pawn structure. That's really where the plan starts. Now the question is, what would the ideal setup look like based on this pawn structure? Figuring that out makes everything else much easier. Since both of black's weaknesses are on the d file, the most logical plan for white is to put both rooks there, and if possible, even their queen. The minor pieces should also aim at d5 or d6, which usually means bishop on b3 and knights on c3 and e3. Now let's compare that ideal with reality. Two rooks on the d file can get there, but it's a bit cramped and the queen probably won't join. The f3 knight is far from its target and the bishop cannot reach the ideal diagonal. Overall, white has a hard time getting into the ideal setup. Now let's do the same for black. If the main goal is to push d5, gain central control and get rid of the weaknesses, both rooks should be supporting it. The queen and minor pieces should coordinate the same way, either controlling d5 or defending e5, since that pawn's going to be exposed after e takes d. When we check the reality or look a bit ahead, for example after queen c1 and bishop e6, we can see that the ideal setup is almost exactly what black already has. That shows us that this plan, even though it starts by creating two weaknesses, might actually be perfectly fine for black. The next stage is calculation, asking yourself, is d5 safe to play next? Or does white have a way to delay it or even prevent it entirely? We won't go deeper here, so pause the video and think it through, and write down your ideas before moving on. Now there are other ways to think in this position. If we play knight e5, we might end up with double pawns in the center, or white might be forced to tolerate our centralized knight. Let's say knight takes, pawn takes, queen f3, and bishop e6. At first, those double pawns don't look great, but there are some positive side effects. For instance, we get a pawn to the 5th rank, similar to what we achieved in the e5 line previously, only this time without a backward pawn on d6 or a weak square on d5. This also means white's bishop stays locked in between two of its pawns, while our bishop can sit comfortably on e6, targeting both flanks. Sure, there is a drawback. In any pure pawn endgame, black would probably be lost, since we cannot create a passed pawn on the king side, while white's queenside pawns are much healthier. But for now, that extra pawn on the king side not only protects our king better, but also opens the door for a potential kingside attack, maybe with knight h5, knight f4, supported by a small pawn storm. That's also why we recaptured with a pawn on e5, to keep the queens on the board and maintain chances to attack white's king. Actually, the symmetry in the center only looks equal. In reality, it favors black. A knight on f4 cannot be pushed away by g3, because h3 becomes the target. Meanwhile, white cannot create the same setup, since our pawn on g6 already controls f5. And if we think about white's potential in this position, it's actually pretty hard to see. Normally they'd want to exploit their only real plus, the extra pawn on the queen side. But even on that side, black actually has more space and perfect conditions for a minority attack. Now, speaking of the minority attack, are the conditions for it already present in the initial position? And if so, why wouldn't black just start pushing the a and b pawns right away? Well, we cannot really push a5 right away. That's another reason why knight e5 makes sense. It centralizes a piece and opens the bishop to defend the b pawn. Let me take a step back for a moment and explain the minority attack, what it is and what it can achieve in this position. For some of you, it might not be obvious why we're even talking about it, so this little detour will make the idea much clearer. Again, I'm taking the pieces off the board so you can see what we can do in theory. By the way, I cannot underline how important it is for you to keep doing the same thing while playing your own games. So keeping that in mind, we now advance a5 and eventually go for b4. If white does not react, we trade on a3 and leave white with two isolated pawns, two weaknesses. Of course, white should take on b4. Now, black has an isolated b pawn, while white's pawns are connected and seem stronger. So, how can this actually be good for black? The logic is that the pawn on c2 is weaker than black's b4 pawn. Even though c2 isn't technically isolated, it might as well be. Its neighbor cannot really help. If that pawn moves, it gets captured and becomes isolated anyway. So it's actually this black pawn that creates a weakness out of the c2 pawn, a perfect target for black heavy pieces. Now, some of you might be wondering, why isn't the pawn on b4 considered a serious weakness too? In theory, it is, but in practice, it's not really a problem. First, that pawn isn't on an open file, so white cannot easily target it with their rooks or queen. And second, black has more space on the queen side, which means our pieces can attack and defend more easily. In general, the side with more space handles its weaknesses much better. In the actual game, black played bishop e6. That move activates the bishop, but what's really striking is that black left it there even after white played knight g5. So after knight e5, knight takes e6 and f takes e, the question is, what could possibly be the upside of doubling your own pawns on the e-file? Well, we take away the d5 square from white's knight, and the center is now under even better control than a move ago. The f-file is open, creating potential pressure on f2, and the idea of knight h5, knight f4 becomes much more realistic. Overall, controlling the center and the f-file gives black a solid foundation for a kingside initiative. Now, we should be fair and say that white has their own targets to attack, and a weakness in the double pawns formation is usually the pawn in front, as it is closer to the enemy camp. So, we would probably see white regrouping in order to bring their restricted knight from c3 to e2 and then to d4. It's unpleasant for black, but white needs time to get it there. The point of this lesson isn't to show who won the game or to highlight some flashy tactic. It's to train yourself to slow down and read the pawn structure, to treat it as a set of clues for your next plan. If you found this helpful, hit like, share with your friends, and drop a comment.